Good day, viewers. Welcome back to class. Welcome to Biology with Omotayo. During our last study, we began looking at the forms in which cell exists. We were able to look at cells existing as independent organisms, unicellular organisms, where we had examples like the paramecium, the euglena, the trypanosome, amoeba, and so on. After which we went on to look at cells existing as filament and as colony. Under cell existing as colony, we saw examples of organisms like sponges. We saw examples of organisms like the volvox and pandorina. And then under examples of cells existing as filament, we saw examples of organisms like the spirogyra, the zygnema, and oscillatoria, among several others. And that was where we paused the class last class contact. Now, in the course of that very last class as well, we illustrated the diagram of the spirogyra, and we saw how the cells meet from edge to edge, a connection edge to edge. That's in a filamentous organism. Unlike in the case of a colonial organism, where the cells were not having a edge-to-edge membrane contact, but rather were connected by cytoplasmic strand. So a quick one before we go on today to look at the later aspects of that very study, forms in which cells exist. Remember I said we've exhausted cells existing as independent organism, and we've equally examined cells existing as colony and filamentous organism. Before we move on to the third, which is cell existing as part of a living organism, before we move into this very third one, I would just like to quickly call our attention to a small table so as to be able to identify basic differences between colonial organisms and filamentous organisms. So come with me. Okay, so now to start with, for colonial organism, as earlier said, the organisms lack intercellular wall. Okay, there is no intercellular wall between the various cells that forms the cluster. So intercellular wall absent. While for filamentous organisms, intercellular wall is present. In same vein, for the colonial organism, cells are connected by cytoplasmic strand. So you have a cytoplasmic strand present in colonial organisms. However, for filamentous organisms, there are no cytoplasmic strand connecting individual cells. Rather, the cells here in filamentous organisms are joined, identical cells are joined end to end, arranged in a linear form. So directly, cells are joined end to end. And then here, under the colonial organisms, the various cells, the cluster of cells that forms the colony are always interdependent. They are always interdependent, and activities are carried out through division of labor. Okay, while for filamentous organism, cells are independent. So there is no any form of division of labor that is existing among organisms that exist as filament. And then these cells arrange themselves in a linear form. So this brings us to the end of our study under cells existing as colony or filament. And so we'll be going to the third point, which is cells existing as parts of organisms. Now, as you can see, the third point, cells existing as part of an organism, as part of a multicellular organism. Now, in this case, when cells exist as a component of an organism, usually they are always group of interdependent cells. When a cell is a part of other cells together forming components of a larger organism or a multicellular organism, such a cell function not independently. Rather, the activities become interdependent. And so, this brings us to our earlier study, where we were looking at cell and how it progressively advances from cell to tissue. That's under organization of life. Okay, group of similar cell performing a specific function together are referred to as tissue. Now, group of tissue, similar tissue, please, performing a specific function forms an organ. Group of similar organs performing a specific function now gives what is known as a system. This is what happens when a cell is a part of a multicellular organism. Because being part of a multicellular organism, such a cell does not carry out its activity independently. Rather, the activities are now interdependent, because group of cells comes together to achieve a given purpose for that very organism. Now, when cells function also as part of an organism, usually such cells become specialized, such that such a cell is enabled to carry out a particular task. And for that reason, such a cell equally begins to have special content. The content of such a cell becomes modified such that the cell will be able to carry out the task it had been committed to. Now, let's take, for example, man. We have several cells that comes together to enable the organism called man, a multicellular organism. Some of such cells, we have the rod cell of the eye. We have the cone cell, still of the eye. We have cells of the muscles. We have epithelial cells, among several others. We have the chondroblast, the cell of the bone, of the cartilage. We have the chondroblast and osteoblasts. We have several other cells that forms different components of the body and have been differentiated to serve that particular function. So, lots of cells. In fact, we have reproductive cells like the sperm cell, like the ova, among several other. We have the nephron, okay, like for the nerves, among several others. All these cells have been differentiated and have now been equipped to serve specific functions. So these various cells work together to now ensure the functionability of the organism called man, a multicellular organism. So this is the case when a cell functions as part of a multicellular organism. So just a few, e.g., examples of cells functioning as parts of a multicellular organism, like taking man, for example. Earlier I mentioned rods, cells of the eye, responsible for black and white vision. Cones, Cells of the eye still responsible for for colored vision now. Epithelial cells, these are cells of sensitive lining, okay, in the internal body parts of man. Chondroblasts, cells associated with cartilages, the osteocytes associated with bone, and several other cells. So with this, we will be coming to the end of the segment of cells that deals with forms in which cell exists. One, under this very sub, cells exist as independent organisms. Two, cells exist as colony or filaments. Three, cells existing as parts of a multicellular organism. Come along with me even as we look further now at basic structure and function of the cell. Basically, generally, living organisms are said to exist either as plants or as animals. The basic structure of the cell will be examined under these two groupings. Even though we know as students of biology that the kingdoms are 5 and are not limited just to Animalia and Plantae, but looking at the structure of the cell, we'll be limiting ourselves to plant cell and animal cell. Come along with me. Now, as you can see, we are moving on to begin to examine cell structures and function. Now, to start with, what is the study of cell called? The study of cell is known as cytology. Just like when we had several studies being examined under Introduction to Biology. We looked at study of blood, hematology, study of microorganisms, microbiology, where we look at mycology for fungi. We look at myology, study of muscles. We looked at bacteriology, study of bacteria, virology, viruses, and so on. The study of cell is known as cytology. Now, cells or a cell is made up of a living component called protoplasm. This was examined as well in one of the previous lessons. The cell is made up of a living component called protoplasm. This protoplasm is then encased in a membrane. And so it can be simply illustrated as this. As you can see it illustrated, the nucleus and the cytoplasm forms the living component of a cell. It is in the cytoplasm that we have organelles suspended all within the cell. Now, the nucleus, the cytoplasm with suspended organelles are now enclosed in a membrane. And then, collectively, everything now forms what we call a cell. So, cell has a living component, and it is called what? The protoplasm. And the membrane that does surround the cell is often referred to as the plasma membrane. However, take note that for plant cell, the plant cell also have what is called a cell wall. And a cell wall is a non-living component of the plant cell. Please take note, the cell wall is a non-living component of the plant cell. So the cell wall is not an organelle. So if you are asked to mention, as we'll be going further to now later see diagrams of the cell and several organelles in it. So if you are questioned and asked to mention organelles associated with the plant cell, you cannot mention the cell wall. The cell wall is not an organelle, it's a non-living component of the plant cell. Also, as I said earlier, the cytoplasm have several organelles suspended in it. They are the cellular structures that carry out the specific functions needed for the cell to run its activities. Now, cells that have defined nucleus in them are referred to as eukaryotic cells. So, for example, what I'm having here is the diagram of an eukaryotic cell. However, if it is a cell with nucleus not well differentiated, then such a cell is referred to as a prokaryotic cell. In our study, our emphasis will be on the eukaryotic cell because that is the type of cell that can be seen in plants and animals. So, make sure you are on board to participate in the next class. During the next class, we will begin to examine the plant cell and animal cell in detail. The required diagram and technique to label and to identify the organelles as well as their functions will be brought on board. Thank you for joining this class. Thank you for holding on this far. Please kindly ensure to like the video, endeavor to share the video as well, and do well to invite others to join us on this channel. Take care and see you next class.